What you probably have heard already is that quality of education is really at the heart of that, and we've talked a lot about curriculum and things like that, but today I want to focus a bit more on the leadership aspects of the new framework. So we're going to have a bit of a look at how we developed the new education inspection framework, look at the leadership research that is underpinning the leadership judgment, but also how leadership kind of underpins the other aspects of the framework as well, because leadership really does permeate throughout. So this is kind of our strategy. I'm not going to read that all out, and you can find that all on the internet. If you are very suffering from insomnia tonight, you can read all our strategy documents. But basically, the intention is that we try to be, as Ofsted, a force for improvement within the system, put children and students first, be independent and be accountable to the public. So those are some of the underlying principles we work to. Obviously, the new education inspection framework is a key part of that strategy. And we've been thinking hard for the last couple of years since Amanda Spielman became Chief Inspector about how we can look at what we're doing now and improve and mitigate some of the unintended consequences that have come from our current framework. So one of the things that we've obviously seen in the system, and this will not come as a surprise to any of you, is that because we have been so focused on data and attainment, that has started to drive a lot of behaviors within the system, things like narrowing the curriculum. So you can see that at Key Stage 2, for example, there's a very strong emphasis on English and mathematics, sometimes to the detriment of other subjects, the foundation subjects in particular. We have seen teaching to the test emerge. That's also not particularly surprising when the accountability system is focusing so strongly on that. And in some cases, we've even seen forms of gaming as well. So one of the things we want to do is to say, okay, let's think back and go to first principles in terms of what the role of inspection in the accountability system is. Because the English accountability system really is designed to have two pillars: the attainment pillar, which comes through the various national assessments, and the inspection pillar. And they were always designed to be different, so inspection was supposed to complement the attainment pillar of accountability and not duplicate it. And I think where we have ended up a bit over the past years is too much duplication, so both pillars of the accountability system, too much doing the same thing and just focusing on that attainment element. So the intention of the new framework is to go or move away from that and focus on what we think really matters, which is quality of education with curriculum at its heart. What are we actually teaching? What are pupils actually learning? That is what really matters. Also, the intention is to make sure that we actually base our framework on evidence. I'm obviously going to talk a bit more about that later on. Make sure that we attend properly to validity and reliability in what we do. For example, in how do we collect evidence, what evidence do we use to come to a judgment, reduce the burden on schools, because what we've also seen is that the emphasis on data has led to a lot of practices such as data drops and the collection of various pieces of data for the purpose of inspection rather than for the purpose of improving pupil learning. So that's one of the things also we hope to mitigate in that respect as well. And obviously we try to think about how can we mitigate unintended consequences. Of course, in anything that we do, there will be unintended consequences, but we're trying to think now, what could they be? We're trying to get through our consultation the views of yourselves and others in the sector. What do you think they might be? And once we start using the new framework, we will be evaluating it to see what possible unintended consequences there may be, so that we can also review and change things if that is necessary. So that's a little bit of the background of it. We have a theory of action in terms of developing the framework. So we started with a number of principles, such as we want to make sure that we have a robust evidence effectiveness construct grounded in evidence. We want to evaluate quality of provision against that effectiveness evidence. So again, the emphasis here on having that evidence base underlying the framework. We want to make sure that the information we provide to providers, to schools, to colleges is actually useful and allows people to use that information to improve. And one of the things that we are looking at is how do we actually write inspection reports in ways that are potentially more useful to schools. Same also to other actors. How can we make our reports useful to parents, for example? How can we make them more accessible to parents and also give more of a feeling as to what is a particular school really like? So always the theory of change then is that providers will, on the basis of that, take action to improve, or stakeholders will react to that as well. So those are some of the principles underlying what we do. The 4 judgment areas that we are proposing in the new framework are quality of education, behaviour and attitudes, personal development, and leadership and management. So you can see leadership and management is still one of the 4 judgment areas. You will see in this graph they are of different size. That's not a coincidence because the quality of education judgment really is the central one in the new education inspection framework. So does that mean leadership and management have become less important? Well, as I will come to later, that's not necessarily the conclusion you need to draw from that, because leadership and management is not divorced from quality of education, of course. So what we have done to try and make that link between the evidence base and the framework is go through a program of research in our research and evaluation team to inform that development. That has had a number of different elements. So we did a review of the literature on educational effectiveness across those 4 areas, so quality of education, leadership and management, personal development, and behaviour and attitudes, to see what evidence was out there and therefore what could we build some of our judgments and criteria on. That research commentary is published. You can have a look at that on the gov.uk website. We also did some original research ourselves, because one of the things that we found was that there is more evidence in some areas than in others. We feel that curriculum is really central to what we need to look at, because that lies at the heart of what we are actually teaching pupils and what they actually learn. But what we found was that there was less recent research on curriculum in England that could inform our judgments. So we did quite a large-scale program of research on curriculum to help us to do that, starting in 2017 with a piece of work where we went into, I think, 40 schools to look at what they were currently doing around curriculum. And when we did that, we found a number of the issues I talked about earlier. So we found things like teaching to the test, narrowing of the curriculum. We also found that there was not necessarily a lot of curriculum thinking in schools, and that's not so surprising because, of course, the system has come through a long period in which curriculum was either prescribed through, say, national curriculum documents and national strategies, and even when more and more schools got curriculum freedom, the non-maintained ones, it was the case that because of the emphasis on attainment in the accountability system, in many cases the exam syllabus became the curriculum instead. Decided to look specifically at schools that were very invested in curriculum development, so a purposive sample of schools who were doing particularly interesting work in that, and those findings were then used to develop a draft model of inspecting the curriculum, which we tested in a more representative group of 64 schools in autumn this year. We've also done a number of other pieces of work. So currently we're looking at validity and reliability of lesson observation and work scrutiny, two methods that are obviously quite central to inspection, and we will be publishing those findings in the middle of March. We also have some research projects ongoing on managing challenging behaviour, so looking at what schools do to manage behaviour effectively, and we have a project ongoing on teacher well-being. Both those projects also to be published soon. So one of the commitments that we have made is to make sure that everything we do is published and available in our research program, so that it's also open to scrutiny from yourselves and from other researchers. So all those things kind of feed into the development of the education inspection framework, along obviously with things like the expertise of the inspectors who are working with us. So also in the area of leadership and management, we try and draw on as much evidence as possible. So we did a review of the evidence on educational leadership from very much an effectiveness paradigm, so looking at where we have evidence that leadership can lead to school improvement and school effectiveness. We drew on a range of sources for that, trying to look quite a lot at some of the research that has obviously been conducted in England and the UK because it's most directly relevant, looking at cross phases, primary and secondary, and trying to see what that is telling us and therefore how can that inform what we need to look at in inspection, because we want to make sure that we look at the right things. What does that evidence tell us? First, it does tell us that leadership is pretty important. There is a lot of research out there that suggests that leadership is the main school-level factor affecting outcomes, and I say school level because there are things that have a stronger impact, in particular what happens in the classroom. So when you look at the factors that affect pupil progress, then what happens in the classroom has the strongest effect, but leadership from the school level factors is the most important one, the second strongest impact we usually find from leadership. And of course those two things are not divorced from each other, because we know that one of the ways that you are effective as a leader is by creating the conditions under which classroom teachers can be as effective as they possibly can be. If you look at it statistically, you see that leadership explains around 5 to 7% of the variance in pupil attainment, and you can say, oh, that's not very much, but that's actually around a quarter of the variance explained by the fact that pupils go to different schools. So when you look at pupil attainment, of course, there are a number of things that influence that. Firstly, there is what the pupil himself brings to the situation, their motivation, their prior knowledge, and so on. That obviously is a very key factor. Then there is what happens in the classroom, and we find, as I say, that that is a key factor that influences. And also we mustn't forget that whenever we look at any measure of attainment, a part of the variance is what we call measurement error, which is a combination of just coincidences. For example, a certain pupil has had a fall from his bike on the way to school and therefore has done this well in assessment. To things like the fact that any assessment is only measuring part of the domain that you are actually assessing. You only got certain items. They do that with more or less reliability, but it's never 100% reliability. A question can always be misinterpreted and so on. So actually we find that leadership is pretty significant, and they mainly work through other factors. So what do leaders do? They do things like making sure that there is a shared vision in the school, that there are shared approaches, and that in turn affects what happens in the classroom, which in turn affects what pupils do. So when we looked at the literature, we kind of came up with 5 main factors that across a number of different studies appear to be important. Things like vision, instructional leadership, consistency, encouraging professional development, and ethical leadership. And those are kind of, when you look at the inspection framework, you will see those things coming back in the criteria that we're looking at in the leadership and management judgment. So what do we find about those things in particular? Please click. Okay, so in terms of vision, obviously this is no surprise. We see that in education, but we also see that in organizational literature across different sectors, public and private. Clear shared vision underpins effectiveness of a school or other organizations. but it has to have some concrete effects. So an effective vision actually influences what leaders do, what teachers do, what teaching assistants do, so it provides a clear sense of direction for the whole of the organization. It should be a touchstone against which all initiatives are actually tested, so you need to think, if you're doing something, okay, does that fit in with what we want to be as a school, with who we are as a school? And as you can imagine, that of course links also with the issue of ethical leadership. Buy-in, of course, is very important then, because it is something that everybody needs to share, and that means that in many cases we see that vision is most successfully developed in collaboration rather than just as a top-down thing that you sort of impose on the school as a leader. Instructional leadership is again one of the most strongly supported factors in educational research, and what that is, it seems very straightforward. It's about leadership focusing on the quality of education. And again, that is very similar to what we find in sectors outside of education, where it's about focusing on the core purposes of the organization. And what is the core purpose of a school? Surely that is the quality of education. If we define it, you can see a definition by Hallinger and Heck, two researchers from North America, who says it's those actions that a principal or head teacher takes or delegates to others to promote growth in pupil learning, make instructional quality the top priority of the school, and bring that vision to realization. So it's really about focusing on that quality of education dimension. Of course, in this definition, which is quite old now, there is a strong emphasis on the principal or head teacher, but we know from more recent research that that can obviously be also a much more distributed process which involves leadership across the school. So you can say, that's really an obvious thing to say, school leaders concentrate on quality of education, but what we actually see in practice when we do research around what leaders actually do, what they spend their time on, is that in many cases a very large proportion, and often the largest proportion of time, is not spent on those kind of activities, but it is spent on administration, crisis management, and things like that. So I have to give you an example. I remember once visiting primary school, and I needed to speak to the head, and couldn't immediately find him because he was up on the roof repairing the roof. Okay, that no doubt needs doing, but is that the best way of a head teacher to spend his time? Probably not. So it's about having hands-on involvement in teaching and learning, and having therefore some views and knowledge and a vision around curriculum, around pedagogy, around assessment. Again, that has some consequences, because especially if you are in a larger organization, if you are part of, say, a large college, for example, that leads to the question as to where does that expertise lie? And again, we need to say that that's not necessarily always the person of the principal, her or himself. That can lie at other layers of the organization instead. Similarly, that may be the case in some multi-academy trusts. But it does mean in an organization you need that level of expertise to be available. Another key factor we see around effectiveness and around leadership of effective schools is the issue of consistency. So what we actually see is when we compare schools on effectiveness, it's not so much that there's that it is the case that in less effective schools there is no good practice. That's not the case at all. Any school you go into, you can find some excellent teachers, some good work in specific areas, and so on. What we find instead is that in effective schools there is a level of consistent quality across different subjects, across different areas, etc., whereas in ineffective schools that tends to be very varied. So what, in fact, leaders are able to do in those more effective schools is reduce the variance by making sure that you don't have kind of a tail of poor practice happening within the school. So that's a key aspect to take into account. And that means that you kind of need to think about how do we align practices at different levels in the school. So, for example, in secondary school, are school level policies mirrored in what happens in the department? Is that vision shared? Are we doing similar things? It's about learning from best practice within our school, because as I've said, there is always good practice that we can learn from. So where is that good practice? How can we learn from it? How can we spread that? Do we use specific methods for that, like lesson study, or do we use observation, or how do we make sure that we build on the personal capital that we have in our own organization to spread that around and to make sure that we learn from each other. It doesn't, of course, mean that we all have to do everything the same. There is a need for flexibility because we are working, for example, with different subjects which have their own disciplinary core, which means that you can't say, oh, let's all teach exactly the same, because what effective teaching looks like in history is not the same as what effective teaching looks like in mathematics, for example. Similarly, we have different pupils that we work for, so again, if we have a particular group that we're teaching, we need to make sure that we can adapt where necessary to that. So it's not about being inflexible, it's about making sure that we remove the poor practice where it is, and that we learn from the best of what happens in our schools. Of course, also very important then is encouraging professional development, and that's one of the things that we have found also in some of our other research. There is quite a bit of evidence that professional development is linked to effectiveness in schools, but it's something that is sometimes overlooked a bit in the day-to-day work of management, because it's not something that you can necessarily point to and say, okay, if we do professional development, that's going to have really quick impacts on the attainment of pupils. It takes more time for professional development to show its effects in schools, but if we want to have long-term sustainable improvement and effectiveness, it is really a key thing that we need to do. There is quite a lot of research now on what good CPD looks like, and a number of years ago a piece of work was produced by the Teacher Development Trust, led by Philippa Cordingley. A very interesting piece of work on CPD. I very much recommend looking at that. Some of the things that they summarized, because they did a big review of the evidence, some of the things they found in that review was you need to make sure that you spend some time on CPD, because often longer term programs are more effective than sort of one-off, one-shot things. So typical doing just, say, an inset about I don't know, updating your subject knowledge, doing that once and then not following up, that tends not to have very much effect necessarily. So you do need to build follow-up in making sure that there's opportunity to practice as well. We often forget that. It's interesting that some of the things that we know and always do when we teach young people, we sometimes forget about when we look at our own professional development. So just in the same way that you wouldn't just teach a child or young person something and then expect them to remember that without any practice or opportunity for follow-up. That's also true when we look at adult education as well. Of course, it needs to be relevant to the needs that we actually have. Professional development is not just something we do for fun of it. It does have to have relevance to what we do, and where we need to think, what we need to think about more there is the fact that just in the same way that, again, young people don't come to our classrooms with the same prior knowledge or background, that is also true of us as adults as well. So we need to make sure that what we do is actually tailored to what we really need. So if I was asked to teach, say, a geography class tomorrow, then a key area that I would need to work on would be my subject knowledge. So I would need some professional development in that. That would not be true of the geography teacher sitting next to me. So make sure that we actually do what is useful for the individual. And interestingly, we need we see that it's important that we develop an understanding of why we are doing certain things. So some understanding of the theory, of the rationale behind what we are learning. There's been a bit of a tendency in recent decades to kind of discount the role and importance of theory in education, but actually there's a lot of evidence that we do things better if we know why they actually matter as well. So, final element in terms of the review of the literature that we did was around ethical practices. And again, that stands to reason that that is important, but we do see a number of things in the system that worry us. Firstly, as part of the gaming that I mentioned earlier, there is evidence in some schools of off-rolling, so where we are illegally removing pupils from the school world for the purposes of gaming the accountability system. That's not the same as legal exclusion. Schools have a right to exclude pupils if they have followed proper procedures for that, but obviously just removing somebody because that is going to harm your GCSE scores or something like that is a whole different matter. So we have been doing some analysis within Ofsted to see, to look at schools which have especially high numbers of pupils going off-roll between years 10 and 11, and where that appears to be a problem, we will then follow that up and try to get to the heart of what is happening here. Of course, we cannot say that something wrong is going on or not. We need to go to the school and find out what the reasons are for that. Another area that is growing in importance is the area of staff well-being. We, as said, we did a big piece of research on well-being, and which we will publish shortly. We did 2 rounds of questionnaires for that, and what we found in the first round, which we did in the summer term, was that 59% of teachers, 35% of senior leaders, and 47% of classroom assistants reported low to medium levels of occupational well-being. That's pretty alarming. That is worrying for us as a system, worrying in terms also of the issue of retention and recruitment of staff, which we know is a big issue. We find that more than half of staff think that their workload is too high, that they don't have a good work-life balance. So again, clearly a big problem with that. We recognize that part of that may have been driven by the way the accountability system has developed in the last few years. And certainly one of the things that we want to look at in the new framework is how can we mitigate that, and also how can we take into account whether or not school leaders are cognizant and give some importance to the well-being of their staff. We don't want the kind of management practices that are particularly deleterious to staff that we hear about in some cases. And of course, in terms of ethical leadership, also in terms of effectiveness, it's important that as schools we do not see ourselves as some kind of self-contained organization, that we engage with our parents and also with our community. We have a responsibility to the community as a whole, and not only to the kids who are at that particular moment in our school. So those are some things that we found from our research on leadership, and those are some of the things that we use to inform the judgment area of leadership and management. So when you look at our framework and handbooks, you will find those kind of things back in terms of how we are going to make judgments on leadership and management. But of course, as I said earlier, leadership isn't just important to the areas of the leadership and management judgment, it actually permeates the whole of the framework. I'm going to give you 2 specific examples of that. One is from curriculum, which is part of the quality of education judgment, and the other is on behaviour and attitudes, just to give you an illustration of really the importance of leadership in all the judgment areas. So, curriculum, I'm going to give you some of the findings from the curriculum research I talked about earlier. So we looked at curriculum intent, implementation and impact, and we found very clearly that the role of leadership is very central in those schools that we selected that were particularly invested in curriculum development. We found, for example, that the role of subject leaders is really key. That's not surprising because, of course, when you look at curriculum, there is a strong subject element to that. And we found that where subject leaders were strongly involved in developing the curriculum of the school or in choosing the curriculum for the school, because it's important here to point out that we do not expect every school to develop its own bespoke curriculum. It can be entirely appropriate to buy in or to collectively develop a curriculum if that works for your particular school. But in any case, subject leaders need to have a view on what works for their subject, why a particular curriculum would work for them. Where we see that that's not the case, and we did find some schools in which they had a strong curriculum, but it was all coming from the head teacher. Those were obviously primarily primary schools. That can work for a while, but what happens when that person leaves the school? We know successful head teachers do actually quite often leave their school. They go and work for the Department of Education, for example. So what do we do then if that knowledge of those skills are not disseminated across the organization? So subject lead is very important, but that has to, the autonomy of the subject lead, of course, has to be within a framework of a shared vision of the school, so you can have that consistency and also the thinking about how we do curriculum across the different subjects and what are the commonalities that we need to develop in the school. So phase 2 showed that, but not just phase 2. Also, when we looked at phase 3, we found leadership to be a key factor. So one of the things we looked at was the intention of leaders around the curriculum in their schools, and on the other hand, the implementation. So how does that actually translated into work plans, into what happens in subjects, into what happens in classroom. And what we did in the third phase of our curriculum study is we created 25 indicators of curriculum quality, which across intent, implementation and impact, and we sent out a bunch of inspectors to look at those indicators within school. They were rated on a 5-point scale. And so we could come to an overall judgment on intent and implementation within each school. Also, just to make very clear here, we will not be using those 25 indicators in the actual live inspections. It doesn't work very well to use a list of indicators in inspection, because as you all know, once you have a particular checklist, then that becomes a management tool in every school in the country, and that leads to distorted and unintended behaviours within the system. Is that if you look at this graph, we see on the vertical axis intent, on the horizontal axis implementation. So schools in the top right quadrant here are those who scored high on both intent and implementation. Schools in the bottom left scored low on both intent and implementation. So you can see generally there's kind of a relationship between those two. So schools tend more often to be either good at both or not so good at both. But you can see here a group of schools in the top left quadrant who score high on intent and low on implementation. You can see most of those are red squares, and those are primary schools. So what is that telling us? That in some primary schools you can have very strong thinking around curriculum at the senior leadership level, but that isn't necessarily translated into good implementation at, say, the subject level. And that, of course, has to do with things like the importance of do we have actually the knowledge around the different subjects in those schools? Do we have enough focus on the foundation subjects as well as the core subjects, those kind of questions. In the bottom right corner, there's an interesting group who score high on implementation but low on intent. You can say, how is that possible? Well, if you see, those are mainly blue triangles, so those are secondary schools. And what you are seeing there is that in some secondary schools, you have very strong departments, in particular individual subjects, but at the senior leadership level, the thinking around curriculum is not particularly advanced. So there we have a bit of a task maybe of disseminating up the good practice and thinking in subject departments to the senior leadership team. So in both those cases we see a clear leadership role. In the high intent, low implementation one, there's then the question of how do we support teachers in those subjects where the implementation is problematic to develop that? Do we provide professional development? Do we work with other schools in a network to draw on complementary skills and so on? So what we also found is that strong subject knowledge was important. That, of course, is in some ways a little bit of a problem, because we know, firstly, that in some subjects we have problems recruiting, so we see people teach out of subjects. We all know that that happens in quite a number of areas. Secondly, in a small primary school, for example, how can we be expert in all different subjects? So what we see there is that support from senior management is really key to support those people who are teaching out of subject or in subjects that they have less knowledge about. Support, as said, in the form of professional development, in the form of scaffolding, in the form of putting people in touch with other schools, with other organisations, subject bodies, for example, who can provide that additional scaffolding for them. We also found that curriculum needs to be ambitious, and we're kind of saying at least as ambitious as the national curriculum. Of course, in maintained schools, the national curriculum is what you will be following, but also in other schools, we certainly don't want to go below that in terms of ambition. Role of subject leaders, role of curriculum planning, and again, that's primarily a task that we need to put in place at the leadership level, ensuring that pupils across the board have access to as good a curriculum as they can, so not providing an impoverished curriculum for pupils from disadvantaged backgrounds, for example. Depth as well as coverage, so when we talk about a high quality curriculum, we often use the term breadth, have a broad and balanced curriculum. That's obviously important, but that's sometimes interpreted as meaning we just need to offer loads of subjects. That's not what really is the essence of having a broad and balanced curriculum, because it's as much about the quality of what you offer as the number of subjects. And having a thought-out model of progression. Again, how do we think about what we need to know to progress to the next year, to the next stage? So looking, for example, at a curriculum across a key stage rather than on a year-by-year basis. So what we do sometimes see is that if I teach in year 5, I don't necessarily know what they've done in year 3 at all, and that can be a little bit disconnected. So again, you can see the role of subject leaders and the role of the leadership team being key in that. Same we see in the judgment area of behaviour and attitudes. Again, key element is high expectations, and high expectations come firstly from senior leadership. I cite here, you see that's a very old study from Rosenthal and Jacobs in 1968. Why am I citing such an old study? It's because it's a pretty seminal one on the role of expectations. What they did in that study was they took pupils in primary school and they gave them a fictitious test. That was supposed to predict how well they were going to do at the end of the year. So what they did is they divided their children into 2 groups, and one group they said they've done really well on this test, and the other group they said they've not done well on this test. It was called a test of attention. Actually, at the beginning of the year, there was no difference between the groups. At the end of the year, you find that pupils who've been randomly assigned to the high potential group did significantly better than those who've been randomly assigned to the low potential group. Why? Because they created an expectation amongst the teachers that that particular group was going to do better than the other ones. And that's what happens, because those expectations then translate in the kind of tasks that are given to pupils, the kind of questions that are asked of pupils. I think you're high potential, so I'm going to ask you that challenging question. I think you're not high potential, so I'm maybe going to give you an easier task. And that led to real impact at the end of the year. So why such an old study? Well, try and get that one for your ethical university committee. These days, I don't think you will find that very easy, because of course, in a sense, you have done harm to the group of pupils who we've put in that low potential group. So ethically problematic, but very powerful in showing the impact of expectations. Again, with behaviour, what we see that consistency is important. And here again, key role of senior leadership in supporting. You have a behaviour. What we see sometimes is a school has a behaviour policy and teachers implement that, but then they do not get the support necessarily from senior leadership, and then what you see is there starts to become inconsistency. You get one set of actions in one classroom, another set of actions in another classroom. That is obviously not helpful to the teacher. That's also not helpful to the pupil, because what we find is that pupils very much value consistency and also value what they perceive to be fairness. When you look at the talk about behaviour at the moment, you'll see a whole lot of heat around what are or are not effective behaviour models, a lot of talk about zero tolerance or restorative justice, etc. Let me say that first, the evidence base on what is the best model of behaviour management is really not as strong as you would think from the strongly espoused positions in this area. So we don't really have that much evidence to say you should use this or that approach. Rather, what we find is that what you need are strongly committed school leaders who support a common behaviour policy across the school, consistency, clear communication, support for staff, and attention to culture and climate in the school, so not just a set of rewards and punishment, but a set of values and beliefs that underlie what is seen as important. Staff commitment to the vision, and again you see the importance of vision coming in here. Parental commitment, so work with parents as a school to get them to understand what your vision is, why you are doing the things you are doing. So those things are really what we see as central to behaviour and attitudes, and again, you can see very clearly leadership runs throughout that kind of strand of the judgments as well. So I didn't want to speak for the full hour because it's nice to have the opportunity to ask some questions. What we say is that leadership is central to what we are trying to do to make schools more effective. I showed you in the beginning the slide with the graph of the main judgment areas, and you can see that we say at the heart of education lies quality of education. Leadership and management also in one of the 4 judgment areas, but in some ways you could say because it's not as central to the framework, it's less important. What I'm telling you here is actually that's not true at all. Leadership is important to every area of judgment in schools. I've not talked about personal development because then I would take up too much time, but if you look at those factors, again you see whole school approaches being very important, things like mental and physical health, so again leadership commitment to that matters. So really leadership remains central to our framework, both in the leadership and management judgment and in the other judgment areas as well. That's really all I wanted to say. Just to remind you that we have written this new draft inspection framework, and that's currently out for consultation. We are taking this consultation very seriously. We have tried to make sure that there's quite a lot of time to respond, so we published everything in January. You have till the 4th of April to respond to our consultation. to make sure that you have time to look at the documents and give a considered response. We've tried to provide more material for consultation than we ever have before. Typically in the past we've only kind of published the framework for consultation. This time we've published framework, but also the handbooks. So the handbooks are what the inspectors actually would use to go into schools, colleges, early years providers. So those are really important documents to look at. And also the research evidence. So I talked about the research commentary. That is also out there and also open for comments. So I would say to finish off my talk, please do take part in our consultations. What you tell us really does matter. We have had around 2,000 replies last time I saw it, which was a couple of days ago. We'd like much more than that, so please go to our website, have a look, and your views certainly matter to us. Questions?
Hi. You spoke at the beginning of your presentation about variation, and school leadership explaining 5 to 7% of variation people attaining.
Yeah.
What is the variation of school as opposed to other factors?
Okay.
In terms of outcomes? That's the first question. The second kind of addendum to that is, does that level of variation? Okay,
yeah, that's two very good questions. So firstly, what is the overall variation at the school level? So that's the question, how much difference do schools really make? Depends a little bit on what measures we use, what attainment measures we use, what country we look at. Typically, it's probably around between, well, when you look at it internationally, it's between around 10 and 45% of the variance. In England, it's towards the lower end, more around 10 to 20%. Does that differ depending on pupil background? The answer is yes. The impact of schools and also of teachers is far greater for pupils from more disadvantaged backgrounds than from more advantaged backgrounds. Up to 3 times more impact of schools and teachers on pupils from the more disadvantaged compared to the most advantaged backgrounds. That is, of course, because pupils from more advantaged backgrounds can draw more heavily on the resources they have at home, both in terms of cultural capital, but also simply in terms of things like the amount of private tutoring, etc., that would be available to a student in a middle-class family. So much more, so that's also why we say school and teacher effectiveness is kind of an equity issue, because the impact is really a lot greater on the more disadvantaged pupils who get less from their actual homes.
Just a quick follow-up. If that's the case, then is Ofsted thinking about reintroducing contextualised measures?
We do not run the accountability system in terms of the measures. That's a job of the Department for Education. So, so just to give you a little bit of background to that, obviously we had contextual value-added measures a while ago. Those were replaced by the Progress 8 measure we have at the moment. When you look at contextual value-added measures, there are kind of advantages and disadvantages to those. Advantages of contextual value-added are that you can obviously build in more different variables, so variables relating to pupil background, which in theory should give you a more accurate picture of the value added by the school. There are some disadvantages to contextual value added measures as well. One of them is a methodological one, which is that you get different outcomes potentially depending on what different variables you put in. So, for example, okay, I put in some measures of background, like say free school meal eligibility. What other variables do I put in? Do I then also put in, say, gender, because statistically goes into better than boys? Do I put in ethnicity? How do I measure ethnicity? So all those decisions can have differential impacts on what the results look like. And that leads to the other question around value added, which is, are we in danger then of reinforcing particular expectations of certain pupil groups. So are we saying that we expect, say, white working class boys to do less well, and we don't need to worry about that so much because in our value-added model that comes out in the wash anyway. So if they do badly, then that is simply an expectation. So that's one of the reasons why they replace them with the progress measure. Statistically, the argument for that is saying, well, most of the background factors are already present in the prior attainment measure because that has more, because when you look at something like the social background, that starts to have an effect very early on in a child's educational career, so that has more impact at the start than in terms of progress later on. There's a lot of discussion about how valid that is as an argument, but I think one of the big arguments was around making sure we don't have low expectations of particular pupil groups, and also about making it interpretable for schools and teachers, because in the end those value-added tables start to become quite hard to interpret. That's kind of the arguments for that, but as I say, it's not Ofsted's job to provide the accountability measures. That's a different remit.